With the looming threat of U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs, a Buy Canadian movement has picked up across the country.
In an unprecedented turn that is shaking the foundations of North American commerce, Canadian supermarkets are now unable to place any product labeled Made in United States on their shelves, creating the most severe consumer market disruption between the two countries in more than 3 decades. This abrupt shift does not come from a trade agreement, a government order, or a regulatory ban. It emerges from a combustible mix of political tension, national outrage, and a public backlash that escalated far beyond what any retailer or policymaker anticipated. What began as a wave of frustration over how Canadians felt treated inside the United States has transformed into a nationwide refusal to accept American labeling in the Canadian food system. For years, Canadian grocery aisles depended heavily on goods originating in the United States. Fruits, vegetables, packaged foods, beverages, sauces, and thousands of everyday items. Suddenly, retailers are forced to confront an impossible reality. They cannot legally, commercially, or socially continue offering products that openly identify the United States as their origin. The disruption is immediate, shelves are emptying, prices are rising, supply chains built over generations are breaking under pressure. And yet, this crisis may only be the beginning. Stay with us until the end, because the final consequence of this labeling ban may be the most shocking revelation so far. The moment Canadian supermarkets became unable to sell any product marked as originating from the United States, a far deeper crisis emerged beneath the surface. The collapse of a labeling system that had governed North American trade transparency for an entire generation. Distributors, wholesalers, and customs brokers found themselves locked in an administrative gridlock. Every shipment entering Canada from American farms, factories, or packaging plants suddenly required relabeling, repackaging, or full product substitution. What used to be a routine cross-border process now resembles a sprawling logistical emergency stretching from coastal ports to inland rail hubs. Food retailers privately admit that the operational chaos is accelerating. Trucks are held for extended inspections, containers are redirected mid-route. Contracts decades old are being suspended or terminated with almost no warning. For industries that rely on precision timing, dairy, fresh produce, baked goods, even a minor delay can destroy entire shipments. And with every disrupted delivery, the pressure on Canada's domestic supply intensifies, exposing vulnerabilities that had been invisible for years. But observers across the continent warn that this is only the first fracture. What comes next could dismantle a critical pillar of North American commerce that no government is prepared to lose. And the implications may be far more dramatic than a supermarket boycott. As the public backlash against American origin goods intensifies, the Canadian supermarket system faces a disruption unlike any it has encountered in the modern era. There is no government directive at play, no official regulation blocking American imports. Instead, a powerful consumer revolt driven by national indignation and amplified through digital platforms has transformed everyday shopping behavior into a nationwide economic force. Shoppers are no longer willing to place anything labeled as originating from the United States into their carts. Items remain untouched on shelves, sales collapse overnight, and retailers are forced to confront a simple commercial reality: products branded as American cannot move. The issue is not legality, but viability. A product that cannot sell becomes an inventory liability. And in a competitive grocery environment, no chain can afford to sacrifice shelf space to goods that the public refuses to buy. This shift places enormous pressure on Canadian distributors. They must rapidly identify alternative suppliers from Europe, South America, Mexico, and domestic producers. Long-standing contracts with American companies are not canceled by political decree, but are suspended because demand has evaporated. Retail buyers describe a retail environment that has turned unpredictable, with certain aisles emptying faster than new stock can be sourced. Families experience the consequences immediately. The disappearance of familiar American brands forces costly substitutions, and products sourced from distant markets require long transport times, meaning fewer fresh options and higher prices. Importers warn that even basic categories, juices, cereals, snack foods, sauces, may become unstable until Canada rebuilds an entirely new supplier network. Yet beneath the economic strain lies a deeper transformation, a cultural redefinition of consumer identity. Canadians who once passively purchased American goods now view their buying habits as an expression of national dignity. The longer the boycott persists, the more entrenched these preferences become. And once new supply chains are built, they rarely reverse. Economists caution that this consumer-driven shift could permanently alter the flow of goods across one of the world's most integrated trade corridors. But even this profound restructuring is only part of the story, because across the border, American producers now face an even sharper shock they had never prepared for. Inside the United States, the effects of the Canadian consumer uprising are immediate and deeply destabilizing. Unlike previous trade disputes, which involve formal tariffs or government sanctions, this crisis blindsides American exporters because it is rooted entirely in public sentiment, a force that Washington cannot negotiate with or legislate away. Producers in states heavily dependent on the Canadian market begin reporting severe declines in demand. Warehouses in Washington fill with unsold apples. Potato storage facilities in Idaho exceed capacity. Dairy processors in Wisconsin and Michigan face halted shipments that once crossed the border daily. For perishable goods, the losses are devastating because unsold produce cannot simply be stockpiled for future recovery. Rural economies feel the shock quickly. Farm income drops, transportation companies reduce routes, and local businesses that depend on agricultural activity experience weakened revenue. Banks that hold agricultural loans report rising credit risk, reflecting uncertainty in regions that were once economically stable due to consistent Canadian demand. The political system in the United States struggles to interpret the crisis. Lawmakers cannot point to a Canadian law or formal prohibition to challenge. Instead, they confront the uncomfortable truth that American products are being rejected voluntarily by consumers across an entire nation. Without a government actor to retaliate against, traditional policy tools offer no immediate remedy. Industry groups privately warn that losing the Canadian market even temporarily would be far more damaging than any previous trade war. Canada's proximity, purchasing power, and long-established integration make it irreplaceable in the short term. Even if new markets could eventually be developed in Asia, Latin America, or Europe, none can match the logistical efficiency of exporting north across a shared land border. The deepest concern arises in strategic briefings delivered behind closed doors. If consumer sentiment alone can cut American exporters off from their largest agricultural market, it exposes a structural weakness in the United States trade model that no administration has ever resolved. And analysts caution that the next phase of this crisis may reveal a consequence even more disruptive one that could force both countries to reconsider the foundation of their entire economic relationship. Within the United States, the unfolding crisis forces policymakers, economists, and corporate leaders to confront an uncomfortable scenario. A major trading partner is not rejecting American goods due to tariffs, treaties, or political decrees, but because ordinary citizens, millions of individual consumers, have collectively decided to avoid products of American origin. For a country that has long relied on predictable cross-border demand, the implications are profound. American analysts studying the decline note that this boycott has struck at the core advantage the United States has always possessed in North American trade: proximity and reliability. Decades of integration under the North American Free Trade Agreement and later the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement allowed American exporters to build supply models dependent on Canada's stable demand. That stability is now dissolving in real time. Companies accustomed to routine deliveries must now reassess risk exposure in a market they once viewed as secure as their own domestic regions. Political strategists warn that the situation is more dangerous than a traditional trade war because the United States cannot retaliate against a government policy. There is no official Canadian regulation to challenge at the World Trade Organization, no tariffs to negotiate, no decree to reverse. The shock originates entirely from public sentiment, which is immune to diplomatic pressure. Even if Washington wanted to respond, it has no direct mechanism to restore consumer trust inside Canada. Large American corporations quietly acknowledge the gravity of the situation. Several multinationals that manufacture packaged foods, beverages, and household staples inside the United States are preparing internal contingency plans. Executives fear that if Canadian consumers shift permanently to non-American alternatives, the lost market share could never be regained. Once supply chains pivot to Europe, Mexico, or South America, they rarely shift back. But what unsettles lawmakers most is the precedent this crisis sets. If consumer sentiment and not formal policy can disrupt a trade relationship worth hundreds of billions annually, then every future diplomatic misstep carries economic risk far beyond Washington's control. The United States is forced to confront a new reality. International trade is no longer shaped solely by government decisions, but by the collective will of citizens and partner nations. And yet, the reaction from global markets suggests an even more consequential shift is beginning to form. Across the world, governments, trade ministries, and multinational corporations are watching the Canada-United States rupture with growing concern. What appears at first to be a regional dispute is quickly being interpreted as a warning signal about the fragility of modern supply chains. The lesson is striking. Even the most integrated economies can be destabilized not by policy, but by public sentiment. European suppliers are among the first to respond. Exporters from Spain, Italy, France, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom see immediate opportunity in the sudden vacuum created by the Canadian boycott. They accelerate negotiations with Canadian distributors, expand shipping schedules, and reroute inventory initially intended for Asian markets. South American producers from Chile, Argentina, and Brazil follow swiftly, scaling up fruit and vegetable exports to replace American produce that is no longer moving. Trade consultants in Asia note that this is the clearest evidence yet that North American markets are entering a period of volatility. Japanese and Korean firms, which have long viewed the United States as a stable gateway for North American expansion, are now reassessing risk exposure. If a single political remark can trigger nationwide consumer retaliation in Canada, these firms worry about similar vulnerabilities in other regions. International financial institutions issue early warnings. Observers from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development caution that the ongoing disruption could reshape global supply routes with ripple effects on shipping demand, insurance costs, and food security across the Northern Hemisphere. Several analysts compare the situation to early stages of past trade war cycles, noting that once consumer behavior drives market shifts, governments often follow with policy adjustments, including the possibility of retaliatory tariffs, even if such measures escalate instability. Diplomatically, allies of the United States express unease. They question whether Washington fully understands the domestic sensitivities of its closest partners. If Canada, historically the United States' most aligned economic ally, can experience this level of public backlash, what would prevent similar reactions in Europe or Asia if political tensions rise? Global observers worry that the United States may face a broader challenge, managing not only government-to-government relations, but also the perceptions of foreign citizens who now hold significant influence over bilateral trade flows. But the most consequential reaction comes from global investors. As confidence in the predictability of North American commerce weakens, analysts detect early signs that capital may begin reallocating toward regions perceived as politically stable. This possibility introduces a new layer of risk that neither Canada nor the United States can easily contain. And it leads to a more disturbing question, one that could redefine North America's economic future if the crisis continues to escalate. As the consumer-driven rejection of American origin products becomes entrenched, both Canada and the United States face a series of long-term strategic risks that extend well beyond the grocery aisle. The most immediate concern is that the informal boycott could harden into a structural realignment of supply chains. Once retailers fully transition to new suppliers from Europe, Mexico, South America, or Oceania, the logistical networks, contracts, and pricing models will evolve to support these new partnerships. History shows that once companies rebuild sourcing strategies, they rarely revert to previous systems unless forced by significant economic pressure. For Canada, the primary risk lies in cost. Replacing American goods with distant suppliers introduces longer transit times, higher insurance fees, and increased vulnerability to global disruptions. Shipping lanes that cross oceans depend on geopolitical stability, fuel markets, and seasonal availability. Any disruption, a port strike, an energy shortage, a maritime conflict could rapidly destabilize food security. And with climate volatility increasing worldwide, Canada may experience unpredictable fluctuations in imports that previously arrived from the United States with consistent reliability. The United States faces a different but equally severe threat. If Canadian consumers maintain their resistance to American labeling, American farmers, processors, and manufacturers risk losing one of their most dependable export markets. Canada's proximity and integrated infrastructure have long been strategic advantages for American exporters. Losing this market would strain agricultural communities already challenged by rising operational costs, labor shortages, and extreme weather events. Beyond economics, the political system in both countries could face heightened polarization. In the United States, frustration among agricultural states may fuel calls for retaliatory tariffs or congressional inquiries. In Canada, attempts to rebuild supply networks could amplify debates over national identity, self-sufficiency, and cross-border dependency. These tensions carry the potential to erode the spirit of cooperation that once defined North American integration. Diplomats warn that if resentment continues to build on both sides, the region could drift toward the early stages of an informal trade war, not triggered by governments, but by public emotion and market reaction. And if that happens, the next phase may expose vulnerabilities in North America that no country is adequately prepared to confront. Despite the mounting risks, the crisis also presents unexpected opportunities for both Canada and the United States if they can adapt quickly. For Canada, the shift away from American products could accelerate the growth of domestic agriculture and food processing industries. Greenhouse networks may expand, small-scale farmers may gain new market access. Canadian brands that once struggled to compete with low-cost American alternatives now find themselves in a position to strengthen national loyalty and build long-term consumer trust. At the same time, new international trade routes may emerge. Partnerships with regions such as the European Union, the Asia-Pacific, and South America could diversify Canada's supply base, reducing dependence on any single economy. This diversification strengthens resilience but also reshapes Canada's economic identity, aligning it more closely with global markets than at any time in its modern history. For the United States, the crisis forces a strategic reckoning. American companies may need to innovate aggressively, reduce production costs, or rebrand products in ways that appeal to foreign consumers who prioritize national identity or political sentiment. Some analysts argue that this moment could drive the United States to modernize agricultural technology, streamline export systems, and invest in new trade partnerships beyond North America. If managed well, the shock could become a catalyst for strengthening American competitiveness on the world stage. International investors observe another emerging trend: the power of public sentiment as a driver of global trade. The Canada boycott illustrates that economic influence no longer flows exclusively through governments and formal agreements. Citizens, empowered by digital communication and collective action, now hold the ability to reshape international supply chains at scale. Corporations across the globe will be forced to rethink branding, political positioning, and risk mitigation strategies in light of this new reality. Yet, for all the opportunities that may arise, analysts caution that the stakes remain extraordinarily high. This crisis is not simply about product labels or supermarket shelves. It is about whether Canada and the United States can sustain an economic partnership that has anchored the region for generations. And the most consequential question has yet to be answered, because the next development in this unfolding story could redefine the future of North American trade in ways that neither country is expecting. As the consumer backlash inside Canada solidifies into a long-term behavioral shift, both nations begin confronting a truth few analysts were willing to articulate openly. The structure of North American commerce can fracture even without a single government directive. The shock has revealed a vulnerability that neither Canada nor the United States accounted for: the immense power of collective public sentiment. Political leaders may draft agreements, negotiate tariffs, or revise trade frameworks, but none of those tools can override the choices of millions of individual consumers acting independently. Canada now faces a strategic crossroad. With American origin goods unable to sell, the country accelerates the reconstruction of its food supply map. Domestic producers gain unprecedented leverage, while foreign suppliers court Canadian distributors with aggressive timelines and tailored transport solutions. Within industry circles, some executives quietly note that Canada may not return to the old pattern of dependence, even if tensions eventually ease. A system built on necessity is transforming into one built on intent. Meanwhile, American policymakers confront an equally unexpected challenge. Their greatest strategic risk is not formal retaliation from Ottawa, but the possibility that Canada's shift becomes permanent. If American exporters lose access to their most convenient and integrated foreign market, it forces a rethinking of national export strategy on a scale not seen since the earliest days of globalization. Market analysts warn that the United States must now prepare for a world in which emotional and political dynamics abroad can shape the fate of industries at home. The deeper truth emerging from this crisis raises questions that extend far beyond trade statistics. Because behind this dramatic realignment lies a twist that neither country anticipated, one that may redefine the balance of influence across the entire continent. The most startling insight revealed by this crisis is not the disruption itself, but what it exposes. For the first time in modern history, the economic gravity of North America is no longer determined solely by national governments, but by the will of the consumers who inhabit it. This marks a profound shift in the mechanics of power between the United States and Canada. Canada's emotional response, fueled by national dignity and amplified by digital activism, demonstrates that a population can unilaterally shift the direction of continental commerce. The boycott was never planned, structured, or legislated, yet its effects rival the impact of formal trade sanctions. Industries worth billions, dependent on predictable cross-border movement, have been reshaped by sentiment rather than statute. This shift has implications that reach far beyond the grocery sector. Investors, foreign governments, multinational corporations all begin reassessing how North American trade truly functions. The United States, long accustomed to setting the terms of regional commerce, faces a new dynamic in which its closest partner can exert enormous leverage without issuing a single policy. And that leverage comes not from political institutions, but from public behavior. The twist becomes even more consequential when analysts consider what might happen next. If Canadians can reshape trade through collective purchasing choices, then other nations observing this phenomenon may recognize their own latent power. Public sentiment could become a tool, intentional or accidental, capable of redirecting global supply chains. In such an environment, traditional models of predicting economic behavior may no longer hold. This realization unsettles policymakers across the continent, because if consumer-driven disruption can destabilize the most integrated bilateral trade relationship in the world, then what comes next may challenge the very foundation of how North America conducts commerce, and the final outcome might be far more disruptive than any formal trade war. The crisis unfolding between Canada and the United States began not with a law, a tariff, or a sanction policy, but with a shift in public sentiment powerful enough to destabilize a trade relationship built over generations. Canadian consumers, acting independently and without coordination, have created a disruption that rivals the impact of formal economic measures. The disappearance of American origin goods from Canadian supermarket shelves is no longer a temporary shock. It has become a defining symbol of a deeper regional fracture. For Canada, this moment marks a historic test of supply chain resilience. For the United States, it represents an unexpected challenge to its long-standing dominance in North American commerce. And for the global community, observing from afar, the situation reveals a new dimension of economic risk, that modern trade is now vulnerable to the emotional, cultural, and political currents of everyday citizens. What began as a reaction to perceived disrespect has evolved into a transformation that could reshape cross-border flows of food, manufacturing, investment, and influence. The full consequences have not yet emerged, but the trajectory is unmistakable.